Well, I didn't think like that for years. It was my father that thought like that. So he was, I don't know, I mean, I suppose he was, well, my mother's quite creative and a little bit scatty and a bit, she would go off chasing fairies and things like that sort of thing. But also, she was quite practical as well. But she loved things like Clarice Cliff, pottery and stuff like that, and she painted. And my father was always very, I don't know whether I'll call it logical, but it was sort of reasonable, or tried to be level-headed.
Reasoning?
No, I don't know. Because he used to have rages as well. You know, and I had periods where, you know, I just used to get really mad with things. I can remember the first time it happened, I gave a talk. This is when I was in my completely withdrawn phase on what my passion was at school. And I completely failed to kind of get anything across. And I got so angry with myself. My job was like, my after-school job was sweeping the floors. And I just overturned all the desks in the room because I was so mad at the fact that I couldn't express myself. That was long before I went to art college, obviously. So I suppose I realised that I was living in this bubble, and I couldn't get out of it by communicating to other people because, well, for a start, I had enormous trouble looking them in the eye until I was 25. And one of my friends pointed out to me that I never look at anybody. So I used to walk around like this all the time, you know, and if somebody was coming down the street in the opposite direction, I would always cross the road. And I still have trouble in big crowds of people. You know, I still get a bit overwhelmed, which is why it's important for me to live somewhere quiet, I think. It's almost as if the internet itself is like that. It's like where people gather together through similarity, but they also gather together. And that gathering together strengthens that one-dimensionalness. So there's a kind of danger as well. We've both grown up at a time before the internet, you know, and probably that's not going to happen anymore for people now. You know, they will have grown up with it. And so that transformation, it's like we remember the world as a playground, you know, the actual physical external world, but also that wondrous sort of endless vista of what people have created in a, I don't like the word digital, but I can't think of another one, but a virtual, you know, space. But it kind of goes further than that somehow, because there is a kind of sense of wonder at the natural world as well. You know, and that's really, really important. And an appreciation of things that just get passed by. We talked about a lot of things like this, and it was like, you know, I don't know, a kind of recognition of a similarity across a chasm of temporal difference, if you like. And that's what kind of brought us together, really, that sharing of how we look at the world. There's no real borders, you know, there are national borders, and people tend to cling in fear to their national borders when they feel under threat. But culturally, in terms of evolution and change, those borders are completely irrelevant. You know, those cultures will influence each other inevitably, and then make something of it that is unique to their culture, and then another culture, you know, or I say another culture, but, you know, those boundaries, there might be a point at which you definitely know you're on one part or another, but there's always a little blurry point. And that blurry point for me is where the interesting things happen. And that blurry point it's kind of symbolised by the, I suppose, by the equinoxes, you know, in the cycle of the year, when you have that midpoint, where or an evening and, you know, or early morning where it's neither one thing or the other, or that actual moment of sunrise or sunset, or moonrise and moonset. That's fascinating because it's a very short moment, but it's neither one thing or the other. And that neither one thing or the other, I think the ability to sustain tension or paradox or indeterminacy, I think is a big part of the creative impulse. And when you are fearful or when you are under threat, you want certainty. You know, you kind of crave it. So you kind of lose that ability to, how can I put it, contain the conflict. And I think being able to contain a conflict inwardly is a huge asset if you don't fall apart in the process. And I think you can, you know, it can get very close to that. You know, you can try to be things that are incompatible, you know, and that is very hard, especially if you're, as I've done many times, fall into this trap of not wanting anybody to be unhappy and ending up upsetting everybody, you know, or more people than I intended. And that, you know, I was brought up, I suppose, one of my father's phrases was, don't upset so-and-so, you know, and I thought, I mustn't upset people. And I grew up with this sense, you know, but that works against you when things are working against your own interests, but you still try and please people, and it just fails. And not being able to face up to that, I think, was a weakness that I've had to deal with. You know, that is, you know, it's had an impact on people, you know, that I regret. But at the same time, you know, I don't really regret anything because you have to be true to yourself. And if being true to yourself means that other people aren't going to like you, then you have to learn to withstand that and take it and move on. And you're kind of not living truly, you know, to them because you're not being yourself. But yeah, exactly. You're not being yourself, so therefore you're kind of, and you know, that other self that you're not being is not, it's like a volcano. You know, it's going to come out at some point, you know, and it has to come out. And you know, that's going to have an impact.
Great.
But there was something else I was thinking of. I think there's a nice thing in Taoism which I've always thought that, you know, an old tree or a dying tree is brittle and stiff and will break, you know, but a tree that remains flexible, even if it's an old tree, will last because it is able to move with the changes. And if we stand still when change is happening and try and preserve things, put up walls and build things to stop things from changing, that's just inevitably going to fail. So, and in personalities and in our friendships and relationships with people, if we start to try and cement it into place, as it were, you know, the change is just going to rumble underneath, you know, and not have room to grow.